July 1944. The mountains of Tuscany, Italy. Second Lieutenant Vernon Baker moved through the terraces of a hilltop vineyard near Viareggio with a specific combination of speed and silence that his training and his instinct had developed, and found what he was looking for in the worst possible way. A machine gun position. Close. Hidden in a cave entrance that he had not seen until he was close enough to be seen. Baker did what Baker did. He attacked it. He killed the 2 German soldiers manning the gun, cleared the position, and continued moving through the terraces, finding and destroying additional German positions in a series of individual actions that lasted through the morning and early afternoon of April 5, 1945, and that, by the time the day was over, had resulted in approximately 26 German soldiers killed and multiple machine gun, observation, and personnel positions destroyed. He did this largely alone, because most of the officers who had been with him had retreated during the night, leaving Baker and the surviving enlisted men of his unit to hold a position that the Germans knew they had taken and were preparing to retake. Baker held the position, led the survivors of his unit out of the German-surrounded hilltop the following night, guided them through terrain that the darkness and the German positions made lethal, and got them back to American lines. He received the Distinguished Service Cross. He deserved the Medal of Honor. He did not receive it because he was black. This was the Buffalo Soldiers' experience in Italy in 1944 and 1945, and it was the experience of the 92nd Infantry Division throughout the war, exceptional performance that was systematically under-recognized by an army that had not decided whether it believed in these soldiers or was merely tolerating their presence. To understand what the Buffalo Soldiers were doing in Italy in 1944, you have to understand what they were before Italy and what the army had decided about them before they ever landed on European soil. The term Buffalo Soldiers had originated in the post-Civil War era, when the all-black 9th and 10th Cavalry Regiments had been assigned to the western frontier, where Cheyenne and Comanche warriors reportedly gave them the name that referred to the quality of their fighting. The name had passed into the tradition of black military service as a mark of distinction and pride, and the 92nd Infantry Division that carried it into Italy in 1944 carried the weight of that tradition along with the specific burden of serving in an army that was as segregated as the society that had built it. The segregation was complete and it was systematic. Black soldiers served in black units commanded initially by white officers who were often drawn from the southern states and who brought with them the specific racial assumptions that the southern social order had produced. The training that black units received was sometimes, though not always, inferior in equipment, in facility quality, and in the specific professional attention that unit commanders provided to units they did not believe in. The assessment that senior army commanders made of black soldiers was shaped by assumptions that the evidence did not support but that the institutional culture was not willing to abandon. The assumption was that black soldiers would not fight effectively under fire, that their courage would fail at the critical moment, that the specific qualities that combat required were qualities that black Americans did not possess. The 92nd Infantry Division's performance in Italy would both confirm and refute this assumption, depending on which engagements you looked at and which factors you chose to emphasize in interpreting what you saw. The division's early combat experience in the Serchio Valley in December 1944 produced the kind of failure that the assumption predicted, a withdrawal under German pressure that reflected the specific combination of inadequate training, inadequate leadership, and the specific psychological burden of soldiers who had been told, implicitly and explicitly, that they were not expected to succeed. The army used this failure to confirm its assumptions. It did not ask whether the failure reflected something about black soldiers or something about the conditions those soldiers had been placed in. It did not ask whether white soldiers under the same training conditions and with the same leadership problems would have performed differently in the same situation. It concluded that the assumption was correct. Vernon Baker and the men who fought like him on April 5, 1945 near Viareggio were the answer to that conclusion. They were the evidence that the assumption was wrong. They were the men who fought effectively and courageously and skillfully in Italy, who performed their mission and held their ground and killed their enemies and did what soldiers are supposed to do, and who were systematically under-recognized for doing it because the institution that should have recognized them was invested in the conclusion that they could not do it. The 92nd Division fought in Italy from the fall of 1944 through the end of the war in May 1945, participating in the final Allied offensive that broke through the Gothic Line and drove the German army in Italy toward the Austrian border. The specific unit performance in this offensive was substantially better than the early Serchio Valley engagement, reflecting both the learning that combat experience produces and the specific improvement in leadership and training that had followed the December disaster. Staff Sergeant Edward Carter Jr. was one of the soldiers whose specific combat performance reflected what the men of the 92nd were capable of when the conditions allowed what they were capable of to be demonstrated. Carter's action on March 23, 1945 near Speyer, Germany, where he had been attached to a unit operating in the Rhineland, was one of the most extraordinary individual combat actions of the European campaign. When his unit's advance was halted by enemy fire, Carter moved forward alone, was hit by fire 5 times, continued advancing, killed 6 German soldiers in close combat with his submachine gun and grenades, and captured 2 others when they attempted to surrender after being unable to kill him. He received the Distinguished Service Cross. He deserved the Medal of Honor. He did not receive it because he was black. Both Baker and Carter received their Medals of Honor in 1997, when President Clinton awarded them in a ceremony that acknowledged what the Army's original review process had failed to acknowledge, that the wartime decorations awarded to black soldiers had been systematically downgraded from the Medal of Honor level that the specific actions warranted to the Distinguished Service Cross level that the institution had been willing to approve for black soldiers. The 1997 ceremony was 52 years late. Of the 7 black soldiers who received the Medal of Honor that day, only Vernon Baker was still alive. The other 6 received their medals posthumously. The Buffalo soldiers who fought in Italy were not the only black soldiers fighting 2 wars in 1944 and 1945. Every black soldier in the American military during the Second World War was fighting simultaneously against the enemy and against the institutional racism of the military that employed him, a racism that expressed itself in the specific forms of segregated facilities, discriminatory promotion standards, the systematic assignment of black soldiers to service and support roles rather than combat roles, and the persistent evaluation of black soldiers against standards that assumed failure before. The evidence was assessed. The Double V campaign that the black press had articulated, Victory Abroad and Victory at Home, captured what the black soldiers of the Second World War understood their service to mean. They were fighting for democracy against fascism, and they were demonstrating, through their service, that the democracy they were fighting for had to include them, that the failure to include them was a contradiction that the victory they were helping to win would have to resolve. The contradiction was not resolved by the war's end in 1945. President Truman's executive order desegregating the military came in 1948. The Civil Rights Act came in 1964. The Medals of Honor came in 1997. The recognition that the Buffalo soldiers deserved came in stages over 52 years, each stage acknowledging something that the evidence had always shown and that the institutional resistance to the evidence had delayed. Vernon Baker lived until 2010. He spent his final years in Idaho, where he had retired after a full career in the Army, a career that had continued after the war because Baker understood that the best way to change the Army was to stay in it and to be the best soldier in it that he could be, which he was. He was asked repeatedly in his final years what he wanted people to understand about his service and the service of the other Buffalo soldiers. He said he wanted them to understand that the men of the 92nd had not fought for the Army that had undervalued them. They had fought for the United States of America, which was a different thing, and they had believed in the United States of America even when the United States of America had not fully believed in them. He was right about the distinction. The Army of 1944 and the United States of America of 1944 were not the same thing. The United States of America was an idea as much as an institution, the idea of a country where what a man was willing to do and sacrifice mattered more than where he came from or what he looked like, and the men of the 92nd had served that idea through all the years that the institution had failed to live up to it. Vernon Baker had fought alone on a hilltop in Tuscany in April 1945 because the idea was worth fighting for. He deserved the Medal of Honor. He received it in 1997. It was 52 years late, but he received it.